Well, I was just
It is
curious
now.
about that, if it's true or not.
Well, I'm going to read
You
it.
have that.
Thank you. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping. Does anybody want a calendar from last week? We're not actually going to talk about it today, but it is still interesting reading. I have several copies available. Brody, do you want one? I have several copies available. Feel free to take two. I've already heard from a couple of people who have been sharing theirs with others, which is very exciting. Good morning. Do you need another one of these?
Yes, sir, please.
There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I also have, I had a request last week to print out the slides. Now, unfortunately, these are not any easier to see. But if you wanted to look at the slides from last week and or take notes, I have, I think, 4 copies of this, if anybody's interested. Anybody? You want? It's exactly what you have right there.
Okay.
Yours is just a bigger version. Yep. Nope. Okay. Okay, by way of review, what did we talk about last week? Kind of a quick introduction to the whole scheme of the Jewish festivals. So we started out by looking at the difference between Eastern thought and Western thought. So Eastern thought tends to be very abstract, or Western thought tends to be very abstract, based on definitions and propositions, and numbers are merely quantities, nothing special going on there. And then Eastern thought tends to be much more concrete. Eastern thought tends to deal in story and metaphor instead of proposition and definition. And in Eastern thought, this is going to be very important today, numbers are primarily symbols and not primarily quantities. They are quantities. When it says 144,000, I think it means 144,000, but it also means something a lot deeper. And we're going to see exactly how that works today. Then we just did like a quick overview of the festivals. There are 7 that are outlined for us specifically in Leviticus 23. If you look at Leviticus 23, it'll give you a complete rundown of all of this. So the actual annual calendar, Josh, would you pass that down? Thank you. The actual annual calendar is represented in these 6 feasts right here, 3 in the spring that are all centered around the harvest, and then 3 in the fall, which are all centered around planting, which happens right before the rainy season. And as we go along, you'll see exactly how significant it is that those first 3 are connected to harvest, and how significant it is that those last 3 are connected to the period right before the rainy season. Very, very important. But what we're going to talk about today is that very first festival. Without question, the most important holy day in the Jewish calendar, and that's Sabbath. So I want to start with a little bit of word association. When you think of the idea of Sabbath, what comes to mind? Simple word, rest. Good. What else? When you think of Sabbath, what do you think about? Positive, negative, indifferent? Saturday? Okay, we're on the right track with rest and Saturday. This is going to be easy. Does anybody have any negative feelings about Sabbath? I mean, we're Christians. We read the Gospels. Is anything positive said about Sabbath in the Gospels?
Well, so to me, the other when you specifically talk about negative, it's like there seemed to be like this gigantic rule book on all the things that you got smacked in the head for if you did on the Sabbath.
Yes.
It's like all these really crazy, you can't do this, but you can walk this far, but not that far.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that. We won't talk about that at all today. We'll talk about that next week. We're going to do at least 2 weeks on Sabbath. But John's absolutely right. Because this is central to Jewish timekeeping, there were lots of rules and regulations designed to keep the Sabbath, to keep the people to keep the Sabbath, right? Read through the end of Nehemiah sometime. There's a lot of baggage with the Sabbath in Scripture, we'll put it that way. And that, I think, should not be glossed over. But for today's purposes, I want to start by looking at a section from the Friday night prayer that has been prayed in Jewish households for thousands of years. It's called the Kiddush. Anybody want to take a shot at the original Hebrew there? So that's the original Hebrew. This is the transliteration. Anytime somebody says, I want the most literal version of the Bible, that's it. Good luck. That's just the Hebrew words spelled with English letters. And then this is the English. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with his commandments, favored us, and gave us in love and favor his holy Shabbat as an inheritance and a remembrance of creation. Every Friday night, observant Jews say those words. Now, I want you to see 2 things. First, Jews view the Sabbath as an inheritance. Have you ever thought of it that way? What do people typically inherit?
Stuff.
Riches, wealth. Typically, when you inherit things, it's something you want to get, right? Do we think of the law of Moses that way? Or because we're Christians, do we think of it as this burden that needs to be shed? Know this for certain. Jews do not see the commandments as a burden. They see it as a blessing. Here's an idea. Imagine someone leaving a toxic work culture where paid time off is offered, but you're discouraged from taking it. You learn to undervalue your rest time and overvalue your productivity. And if this goes on long enough, then you may even start to look down on people who do take time off. All the while your health is failing almost as quickly as your marriage. Then you get a much better job, but when you get there, you notice something is different. Not only do you get a lot of PTO, but people actually take it. And they enjoy it when they take it. You claim to not need such things, that the joy of work is your rest. But during the onboarding process, you discover that the company has a policy. You have to take 75% of your PTO by the end of the year or you get fired. Now, if you think that's an exaggeration, there are companies out there who do that. Why? You need the time off. I think it's a lot deeper, though. What is that company trying to do? What is that company reacting against? Burnout. That company is trying to prevent burnout. That company is trying to create a culture that values the worker as a human being, not as a machine. But because our culture at large primarily sees human workers as machines, people come to that company and they don't know how to take time off. Even if they wanted to. It's been beaten into them for decades that your value is in your work. And so PTO goes unused. I can't tell you how much PTO goes unused, even in an organization like mine, where it's not about get the next iteration of the app out into the market so we can make more money. And so the company has to put a policy in place that says, no, you have to take time off because I'm trying to change culture. Do you see where I'm going with this? Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we cover the Exodus. Okay. The second thing I want you to notice is, what does Sabbath celebrate? What does Sabbath remember? Creation. Interesting. This idea comes from one of the Ten Commandments, actually. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or your sojourner who is in your gates, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the Sabbath day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So what do we need to talk about? I think we need to go back and look at creation and figure out what's going on. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer. I have a hard time talking about creation because I tend to take up the entire time talking about creation. Genesis 1 is by far my favorite chapter in the entire Bible. So if we get to, check your watches, if we get to 9:30 and I'm still talking about creation, somebody give me one of these. Because we need to move on. It's quite brilliant. Now, I'm not actually going to put it up on the screen because it's a lot. So if you have a Bible, digital, physical, or otherwise, turn to the very first page of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1. There we go. Okay. How does it start? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, have you, Western Christian, have you ever counted the words in Genesis 1:1? Why? What are numbers primarily to you? Quantities. It doesn't matter how many words are in Genesis 1. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But if you're an Easterner reading in the original language, what are you doing? Probably. How many words are in the original Hebrew in Genesis 1:1? Isn't that interesting? I wonder if that's a coincidence. And it goes on. Now, the earth was formless and empty. So, Israel sits in a very interesting place in geography in its little area of the world. So here's the world concerning the Bible. If you're reading the Bible, it's happening here somewhere. Over here we have Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria. Over here we have Egypt. Those are the two major superpowers for most of the Bible story. Rome's going to be over here. Paul's going to travel over here a lot. And then right here in the middle, we have the world of Israel. Do you notice anything interesting about where Israel sits? In the middle? Well, from this perspective, yes,
Yeah.
in the middle. But what does it sit in the middle of, John?
It's crossroads.
It is a crossroads. I want you to kind of blur your eyes. What colors do you see? Interesting. So the Hebrew words for formless and empty are tohu and vohu. And tohu is this idea of just this chaotic nothingness that you can't really get your arms around. It's wild. And vohu is this idea of emptiness. Nothing exists. It's almost like a void. Now, when you think of those two word pictures, because again, Easterners deal in metaphor and word pictures, what's wild and chaotic and constantly moving and changing? And what's empty? Now, this is one of Robert's few original ideas. I can't actually find any support for this in the academic world, but it seems to me that it's very likely that the original author is saying the earth was a sea and a desert and completely uninhabitable. Because again, we're talking about an agrarian society. So what use is land that you can't grow anything on? What use is the sea that's completely salt and you can't use to grow anything? What use is the desert where there is no water at all? Look at these two extremes. Too much water, not enough water. And what sits right in the middle? The Hebrew word for this is shalom. Shalom sits right in the middle. So the author is telling us the world, when God first created it, was useless because it was completely unbalanced. It was both the extreme of formless and the extreme of empty. And this is how God made it shalom. Okay, moving on. Day one, God creates night and day. And he does it with three verbs, three action verbs. He speaks, let there be light. He divides, he separates the day from the night, and he names it. He calls it something. He says, this is day, this is night. And then he sees that it's good. And then we get this little interesting refrain, evening and morning. Why is it in that order? Why isn't it, and there was morning and there was evening? The day starts at night, remember? We talked about that last week. The day starts at night. Understand this about the Sabbath. From a Jewish perspective, your day does not begin with productivity. Your day begins with rest. Primarily, to God, you are important because you're human, not because of what you do, which is very different than the gods around them. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Then day two, day two, God creates water. He creates one sphere of water, and then he divides it, and he names it, the thing dividing it. What does he name the thing dividing it? Sky. The Hebrew word is rakia. That's where the King James gets the idea of firmament. Now, if that's confusing, maybe this will help a little bit. This is the ancient idea of cosmology. This was widely accepted in the ancient world as how the world worked. You had water. Most things were water. And what God is doing is he's creating a separation between the waters above and the waters below. And that's called sky. That's called rakia. When the 70 elders go up on Mount Sinai with Moses, it says they're walking on something that looks like blue lapis lazuli. And the Hebrew word there is the same Hebrew word here. What's the idea? When they're on Mount Sinai, what are they on? They're on the sky. Dividing waters from waters. Now, day three, he separates what from the water? Dry land. He moves the water over and he brings dry land out of it. Why do we need to move the water over and bring dry land out? What can't happen in salt water? You can't grow food, so what use is it? But what can you do with dry ground? You can grow food. And so what immediately happens after he creates dry ground? What does it say? All of a sudden, things start growing. All right, we're getting somewhere. Evening and morning, the third day. Day 4, he puts lights up in the skies. And this is interesting. He changes things up a little bit. He speaks and he appoints lights to rule the sky and to keep time. You remember what we said the word for appointed times was regarding the festivals? Moedim. That word, this is the first place that word shows up. The lights, the stars, the moon and the sun are meant to keep the festivals. So the festivals are directly connected to creation. Okay. Got to move quickly. Oop. Then on day 5, creatures in the sea, creatures in the sky. He speaks again, but this is the first time he does this. He blesses them and he says what? Yeah, be fruitful, multiply, swarm. Do your thing, fish and birds. The pattern is starting to change. In the first 3 days, he was just naming things and separating things. Now, he's filling the spaces he separated with things that have a job to do. And that goes on in the 6th day, where he makes man and land creatures. He speaks, he blesses, and he appoints humanity with a job. He says, rule over everything that I've created. And then on the 7th day, he blesses everything, or he blesses the 7th day. He makes it holy because the 7th day is the day he stops. And everything's done. Now, what do you see? What jumps out at you? Or maybe what do you not see? What jumps out at you because of its absence? Can you see? Is it big enough?
Understood that God created the water and the dry land, but then he creates in the order in which it's necessary for man's survival. We have to grow the food, but we need the sunshine because that's necessary
That's right.
for growing the food. And food to eat, and animals and things, man can't survive. So, if all these things were in place, they created man. And everything was there for man to eat, for man to enjoy, and it was perfect.
It was specifically, God says it's very good. Jim's going to talk about the Hebrew word for very a little bit later, so I won't spoil that. First of all, it's interesting that day 2 has no "it was good." Why? What did we just talk about with the formless and the empty? There's nothing good about a watery abyss because you can't grow food. Because again, the focus of this creation account is creating a space, as Carol just pointed out, a space for humanity to thrive in. And you can't do it in Waterworld. Well, I mean, maybe Kevin Costner can, but most of the rest of us can't. No gills and whatnot. But what else do you notice?
Some would argue that the days were not 24 hours, but at the end of each day, there was evening and morning. It's interesting.
Do you see the order? Do you see the structure? Do you see the progression? God is a very detail-oriented individual. And he's very neat. And again, we started with this idea of chaos and purposelessness. And God is bringing order to it, and he's giving it purpose. But then what does he do? Apparently, it doesn't take that long. Apparently, it doesn't take him that much effort, which is awesome and a great subject in and of itself. But why does he need to stop? Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. God stops not because he's tired. Why does God stop?
Because he knew his creation was going to need to stop and rest and worship.
He's got help now. He's got lights to keep time. He's got fish and birds to handle the water. And he's got man to handle everything. Now, obviously, we're not going to do this by ourselves, because when we try, we make a mess of it. But God is creating a system. God is creating something that can run.
On the seventh day, he created rest.
On the seventh day, he created rest.
He created night and day, and waters, land, vegetables, lights, et cetera, and rest. The seventh day, he created rest.
But why?
Does it have to appreciate what you got?
So I came across this really interesting idea a couple years ago. If you look at ancient accounts from other civilizations of what it took to build a temple and to dedicate it and to put the presence of your deity in it, it looks very similar to this account. So there's a piece of this, I think, where the author's trying to tell us that creation is God's temple. And the seventh day is God's presence taking up residence in his temple. Because that's what the word ceased means. It doesn't mean, whew, that was a lot. I'm going to go on a 2-week vacation. No, quite the opposite, actually. It means that God moved in and took over control of the cosmos, so to speak. So he spends 3 days separating spaces, light and dark, water and sky, water and dry ground. Then he spends the next 3 days filling those spaces with functionaries. The lights have a job. They separate day from night. The fish and birds have a job to be fruitful and multiply. The humans have a job to be fruitful, multiply, and rule over the rest of creation. And each of the first 6 days follows this pattern. God speaks, God sees it happen, God calls it good, and the day ends. Then after that, he rests on the seventh day, blesses it. But then what is missing? What happens at the end of every single day? What does God? What does the author? What does the narrator say? It has an end. What doesn't happen? Look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. What do you not see? There's no evening and morning. What does that tell you, Jill?
It's meant to be a perpetual state.
That's how it was always supposed to be, forever. Have you ever noticed that before?
Say that again.
The seventh day has no evening and it has no morning because it was never supposed to end. The evening and the morning refrain marks the end of the day, as Bryce pointed out, but the seventh day doesn't have that.
So we're in the seventh day.
Ooh, interesting. I think Adam and Eve were definitely in the seventh day. Let's flip over the next page and look at chapter 2. So, just my personal opinion, chapter 2 is a more detailed account of what the world looks like during this endless seventh day, right? Where Adam takes on this co-creator status with God. He's like a junior vice president to the CEO of the universe, right? And we know that because he picks up where God left off in day 3. What does God do? He names things. What does he not do starting in day 4? He doesn't name anything anymore. But then what's the very first thing we see Adam doing? He's naming things. So what does that tell you about mankind's role in the universe? We're co-creators with God. God wants a partnership. God wants a relationship. God wants, like a father with a son, to bring us along and show us the ropes. He gives us that dignity and that status. So when God creates woman out of man, what's the very first thing Adam does? He names her. What does he name her? Woman. Because, what does it say? Because that's what she is. Skip ahead to Genesis chapter 3. At the end of Genesis chapter 3, go look. What does Adam name Eve? Eve. Why? What does Eve mean? Yep. Yeah, she's the mother of all living. So if woman is what she is, Dacus, what is Eve? It's what she does. What has happened between those two moments? Sin. So what changed, Jim? What do humans start to value about each other? So did the seventh day end? In a sense,
It crashed. It's still there.
yeah, it's 9:30. Sorry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what Sabbath means here. So, yes, sir.
In some Jewish apocalyptic language, they look at 7,000 years.
Yep.
That probably that was misappropriated into some reform teaching.
Right.
But they look at the Adamic 1,000 years, and that we're in the 7th of those 1,000 years. It's not ended.
God has made 7 ages, I believe it says. And the 7th age or the first 6 ages are for coming and going and creating, and the 7th age is only Sabbath continually, right? That's what it says. Now, what it means, well, we can talk about that offline. I didn't bake that into my lesson for today, but
That's a nexus in concept, though, to point to a reality of God's ongoing work and man's ongoing role.
yes. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a quick question. Do we know how much time passed from the 7th day, morning, I guess, till the fall?
I have no clue. Does anybody else know? The question was, how much time passed from the beginning of Genesis 2 to the end of Genesis 3? How much time passed? Couldn't tell. And I have not found any intelligent answers to that question. Okay, we are probably not going to get through.
Let me throw out one thought here for a second.
Yes.
It's always been in my mind. So the first 6 days, the first time of creation, all the days, just things were created. But when God rested after he created man, it's entered my mind that nothing leaves him necessarily when he creates plants, trees, and fish.
Nothing leaves him?
Huh?
Nothing leaves him when he makes plans?
Just go with me for a
Yeah.
second. But yet, I think about Luke 8 when the woman touched the hem of his garment and his power left him. We're made in his image. I think about all these things, and some of us we're from God, whereas the other things aren't. I wonder if that also required him, or I shouldn't say required him, because God can be all powerful, we say all these things. But if we're made in his image and we have his spirit and we have these things, I just think that is a difference in the other creation things, and it may be a reason why he rested.
I think you're onto something. I do want to point out something, though, if you go and you look at Genesis 1. So in Genesis 2, God takes dirt, presumably dirt mixed with water, because it says springs were coming out of the ground, and he makes a human being, and he breathes the breath of life into it, right? There's that power going out. It says the exact same thing about the animals. It says the exact same thing about the animals. He breathes the breath of life into them. Something to think about. Yes, Carol? That's Genesis 1.
Genesis 2.
Genesis 2.
We're going to preach that this morning. My father always told me that my dog did not have a soul.
I'm going to let you handle that, Jim. I'm shutting that down right now.
So I think you look at fishing in a different way.
The breath of life is not in the fish, Chuck. Carol, did you have your hand up?
Well, I was just going to say that when in creation, God said that there be, there was.
Yes.
When it comes to man, he formed man out of the dust of the earth in his image. And he said, let us form man in our image. So somebody else was there
Yes.
at the creation.
Yes.
And then God created man and put him to rule over all of this. I mean, look what all Adam had whenever he woke up.
I know, and look how much we messed it up.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yes. Look at everything we've been given and look at how we've messed it up. Now, Shabbat, the Hebrew word for Sabbath, is actually not Sabbath. It is Sabbath, but it's not Sabbath. Sabbath is spelled with the H at the end in English. It's more accurately translated with the H at the beginning. So that's just a little tidbit. Anytime you read these words, these Hebrew words that are untranslated in the Bible, just know that sometimes it's not right. Anytime you see a B at the end of a name, for example, it's probably supposed to be a V. That's just a peculiarity of transliteration. And with Shabbat, the sh is at the beginning, and the TH at the end is hard. Is that accurate, babe? Okay, thank you. My Hebrew assistant over here. It means to stop. It doesn't actually mean rest. The idea is rest, but the word itself, most literally translated, means to stop, to cease. Now, I find just that tidbit by itself profound, because as Carol pointed out, we were given everything. And we were put in charge over everything. Every dog, every fish, every tree, every ecosystem. Humanity was meant to be primarily like John and to take care of the world. But what, not going to try to get political, what have we done to the world? Both physically and spiritually. What have we done to the world? We've made a right mess of it. How did we do that? Did we do that by stopping to do things? Did we do that by ceasing doing things? Or did we do that by making one mistake and then making another mistake? Oh, we've got to fix that mistake with this mistake. And oh, that mistake, we can definitely fix that mistake with this much bigger mistake. When maybe the answer was embedded in Genesis 2:1 the entire time. Just stop. How many problems in our world would we solve if we just stopped? Just stop. Just delete your social media right now. You don't need it. You have real friends. Just stop. Nobody wants those memes. Nobody wants those cute cat pictures. They definitely don't want the offensive language. They definitely don't want to be told how wrong they are. They know how wrong they are. Everybody is acutely aware of the problems in their life. And so maybe we should just stop poking at them. The second thing we notice from this account, from the very first mention of Sabbath, is that Sabbath is the idea of taking up residence in something. The best way I can think of to describe this is, imagine you've just cut your grass. You've just pulled the weeds out of your flower bed. You've just put in some beautiful daisies. You're hot, you're sweaty, you're tired. You get a glass of lemonade. Do you just go inside and shower? Or do you sit down in it and take it all in and go, I'm done. This is what I've been working for 8 hours.
And this is good.
And this is good. This is very good. After you've made a meal, do you immediately start cleaning up? I mean, we clean as we go, but what do you do? You sit down and you enjoy it. Where's Bob? When you're done with a painting, Bob, or Jody, when you're done with a painting, Do you paint over it and start over again?
Sometimes.
Or, what's more appropriate? If it's for you, you frame it, put it on the wall, you sign it, you look at it. I printed out one of my favorite images from last year, and I just put it on the wall, and every time I walk by, I just look at it. I'm enjoying it. It was really cold that morning, and I want to enjoy it. Or if it's a gift, if you're giving it to someone, if it's a card, what do you expect them to do? Enjoy it. That's the idea behind Shabbat. The Hebrew word for this is shalom. When you finish that yard, everything is as it should be. Every blade of grass is the right height. The flowers are in bloom. The leaves are bagged. Everything's as it should be. So now we can just settle down and enjoy it. And there's a very real sense in which that's something we're supposed to be doing right now. We're supposed to be taking breaks from our week. We're supposed to be taking breaks from our work and enjoying it. And honoring the fact that God does the vast majority of the work. God does 6 days worth of work. Genesis chapter 2, the only thing they had to do to eat was to reach up and take the fruit off the tree. That's it. That's the idea. That's what work is supposed to be. We made a mess of it because we couldn't stop. But there's also a very real sense in which we're simply pantomiming the actual seventh day, I think. I think this is a case of now and not yet.
Robert.
Yes, ma'am.
It's unfortunate that the word shalom is translated in our English Bibles as peace, which we sometimes distill down to just the absence of conflict.
Correct.
But there's so much more that's meant in that word than what an English word can relate.
Absolutely. If you, let's see, when are we getting to this word? It's probably not actually in the Bible Project reading plan, but there's a great Bible Project video on the idea of peace. And the very first thing he points out about the Hebrew word for peace, which is shalom, is that at its core meaning, its most basic meaning, it means a complete wall that has every stone in place. A wall that is complete and has every stone in place. That's the idea of shalom in Hebrew. One more, I think. Yeah, one more. Eeh. 7 represents the end of a process. Back to the artist analogy. How did Michelangelo know when David was done? The sculpture, David. How did he know when it was done? Bob, Jody, you want to weigh in on that?
Can I comment?
Of course.
It is said, who knows whether it's true or not, but it is said that Michelangelo knew that there was a David or a whatever in that marble. And when he got all the excess marble taken off, it was complete. It was there.
It was
Now, that may or may not be true.
I think it's beautiful. Whether it's true or not, it's beautiful. And it kind of gets at the idea of how God thinks of things, right? Does God know what's going to happen? Probably. I can say with a fair amount of certainty that he does. You stop when, oh, I like that, Jim. You stop when you're satisfied. If Michelangelo had taken one more swing, he would have ruined David. It would not have been the masterpiece that we see it as right now. But what compelled him to stop, and artists know this, I'm picking on Jody and Bob, but I know there's more artists in here. Artists know this. You just know when it's done. And a great artist knows when it's done because they had that idea the entire time. Like, this is where I want it. This is the point I want to get to. This is the process that I'm going to take to get it to this point, and then I'm going to stop. The reason we have so much trouble stopping, I think, is rooted in anxiety. We don't know when enough is enough because we're terrified that we're going to stop too soon. That for some reason, for whatever reason, it depends on us to fix the problems of the world. Maybe just one more spreadsheet, one more client. I can mow this lawn one more time and then it'll be perfect. What do you do if you run the lawnmower over it too many times? And you lower the deck too many times? You go right back to dirt. God took us out of the dirt. He doesn't want us back in the dirt. All right, we only got through half of what I wanted to get through today. But fortunately, I did a very smart thing. And I picked a topic that only has 8 lessons for a 13-week course. So I gave myself some room. So we'll finish this next week. Thanks, guys.